Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. It is Thursday. Let us begin with a look at where we are up to in the Rambam. We are up to the laws of Psulei, HaMukdashim, invalidated offerings in the HaMukdashim chapter 8. Let's take a look at where we have come from. Rambam's Mishnah Torah with 14 volumes. We are in volume number 8, Sefer Avoda, the Book of Temple Service, which has nine topics. We spoke about the Beis HaMikdash, about the vessels, about entering the Beis HaMikdash, about things forbidden on the altar, about how offerings are brought, about the daily offerings, and now we're learning about offerings that have become disqualified. There are 19 chapters. We are up to chapter 8. Please God, you'll see me again on this topic once more next week. They are divided in these topics. The first spoke about invalidation through shechting, when it wasn't shechted correctly, or in the wrong place, etc. Invalidated through the bloods. The bloods weren't sprinkled correctly. Then we spoke about if it happens when it's on the altar or off the altar, if it should be removed, if it's still being put on. What happens to the animal that was invalidated? What do we do with it? What happens if cash and or animals get mixed up? And now we're learning about birds being mixed up. And as I mentioned, this is called kinnim. A kin means a set of birds. And this mix-up of birds is one of the most complicated sections of Jewish law. It actually constitutes an entire tractate in the Mishnah. I think it's actually the final section of the Mishnah of the laws of purity. And most of today's Rambam, although it only has 11 halachas, is extracted from straight out of the Mishnah of Kinnim. Let's take a look. Before we look at the text, just one general introduction. There were numerous occasions where a person would need to bring specifically a set of doves or turtle doves. It could have been if somebody had some kind of emission, which sometimes was due to sickness, a man or a woman, a zav or a zava. It could have been if somebody had sara'as. The different scenarios where a person would need to bring a set of doves. And when he would bring a set of doves, one dove would be offered as a chatos, as a sin offering, and one dove would be offered as an oila, as a burnt offering. So what's the difference? Well, there are a number of differences. One of which is that part of the bringing of the birds, part of the process of the offering would be that the blood would need to be sprinkled on the altar. Now, where would it be sprinkled? It depends what type of offering it was. So he's just brought a pair of doves to the temple. One gets designated as an oila offering, and its blood is sprinkled on above the line. There was a line, a sikra, a line that went around the altar, and an oila offering its blood would need to be sprinkled above the line. And a chatas offering, its blood would need to be sprinkled below the line. I just heard from Rabbi Gordon. Yeah, that's a good way to remember this. Wish he would have told us 3 years back, because every year I get confused about this. Oila in Hebrew means to go up, like aliyah. Chatas is sin. When a person sins, it pulls them down. So that's the clue. The oila offering, the blood is always sprinkled on the top of the line, and the sin offerings, bird's blood, is always sprinkled up below the line. Now that we know that the offerings are offered in different ways, if the birds get mixed up, then we have a problem. I mean, a bird is a bird. How are you going to know if it's a sin offering bird or if it's a burnt offering bird? If it's a chattas or an oila, how will you ever know that? Well, you won't. And that's going to cause problems. Now, there's two possibilities. The one possibility is a person went, he purchased these two doves, and he took the two doves and he looked at them and he said, okay, you, Mr. Dove, Mervyn, I'm going to use you as a oila offering. And then he took the other dove, maybe Irvin, and he said, Irvin, I'm going to use you as a sin offering, as a chattas. So you're my oila offering, and you are my sin offering. So, so all good. So he's just got to make sure that the oila offering gets treated the way it needs to be treated, and the chattas offering gets treated the way it gets treated. We got to bring in chayla. That's good. Okay. Elke, Tati ist mit der Klasse, aber heute gehst du haben da Eises, du darfst unter der Apron. Okay, sag ich schon gleich. Du kennst Devin, aber du darfst unter der Apron. Oh no, okay, Tati gibt der Klasse. Back to you. So we have, he's having here.
Expert's opinion you're not taking.
Sorry?
I say your expert opinion that's being given, you're not taking.
What are you referring to?
Your little girl.
What was the opinion?
No, whatever was being said.
No, she's getting it. I said she could have a lolly, but she needs to put on an apron. You can also have one.
Okay.
Back to the birds, my little birdies. Those are my kinderlach. Now we'll talk about the birdies. So we've got this birdie over here on the right that I've said, you know what, you're going to be my oila offering, my burnt offering, and I've got this birdie on the left that I've said, you're going to be my chattas offering, my sin offering, and all good and fine until all I need is for them to fly out of my hands for 1 second. I mean, I guess it depends how well I know them. But if I don't know them too well, then suddenly I'm not sure which one's which, then we have a problem because I don't know which one's which. Once I've said to this birdie that you're an oila and I've said to this birdie that he's a chattas, I don't need to say it to them. I just need to just decide. Once I've decided that this is an oila and this one's a chattas, then that cannot be changed. As opposed to if I just bring my pair of two birds and I don't specify which bird will be used as an oila and which bird will be used as a chattas, then that makes things a little bit easier, as we'll see in the following halachas. So with that introduction, let's see what happens with all types of mix-ups. Ich habe das hier jetzt. Nein, nicht jetzt. Ich habe gesagt, nicht jetzt. Okay, we're talking about. I took some pictures of diagrams, which I'm seeing if I could share with you. Otherwise, we'll go straight to the text. Okay, but now, so when a sin offering of a dove becomes intermingled with a burnt offering of doves. So basically, I've got this, I won't say cage because that doesn't sound safe. What's a not safe, it doesn't sound pleasant. What's a pleasant, dignified way to hold birds? What do birds live in?
Cage.
Cage?
Coops. Yeah.
Coop. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Ken. So I've got my coop over here, and in this coop over here, I've got, it's not this big, it's actually huge. It's as big as it gets. And inside of that coop, I've got 10 birds. And they are all chattas birds. They've all been designated to be used for a chattas. And then I've got a second cage over here of oila birds. They've been designated to be used as an oila. And then somebody left the window opened, and one of the oila birdies flew into my chattas cage, my chattas coop. So one of these birds over here are actually not a chattas. Now, I'm not allowed to bring a non-chattas as a chattas. I can only bring a chattas as a chattas. but I don't know which one it is, or vice versa. Or if one of the Chattas birds got mixed up into the Oila cube, even if it was 1 in 10,000, okay, darf ich versparen, Tietje? Maar we gaan weer bij het gaan. Das ist super Sache. Ich darf versparen. Ich habe gesagt, nicht jetzt. Wir machen einen Plan. Thank you. So we've got one cage over here, the other cage over here, and we've had some crossbreeding over here. One of the Chattas birds got mixed into the Oila cage, or one of the Oila birds got mixed into the Chattas cage. Even if we're dealing with 10,000 birds, they all need to die. Because once they've been designated as an offering, they cannot be used for any other purpose. But I can't, unfortunately, use them as an offering either, because I'm not allowed to bring an Oila as a Chattas, and I'm not allowed to bring a Chattas as an Oila. But when does that apply? When their identity has been explicitly determined when they were purchased, meaning the owner said, this little birdie or this cage will be used as a Chattas, and this bird will be used as an Oila. If, however, one brought doves to fulfill his obligation, so I just brought a group of doves, and I plan on using some of them as a sin offering and some of them as a burnt offering, but I haven't said explicitly which will be used as a Chattas and which will be used as an Oila, then a dove designated as a sin offering or as a burnt offering, and then they became mixed. So then the following laws will apply. So what are the laws? One moment. Okay, we can slide it up both. Okay, so if a dove designed as a sin offering became intermingled with this unspecified groups of doves, so now I've got, let's say, 10 doves that were still unspecified. They could have been used as either a Chattas or an Oila, either as a sin offering or a burnt offering. But I've got one dove that was assigned. So one dove which was a sin offering, and now it gets mixed into the coop. So the number of burnt offerings in the unspecified group and the sin offering that became intermingled with them are disqualified. Where a sin offering has become intermingled with burnt offerings. Again. Yeah, okay, so here we go. So I've got this cage, and this cage has 10 birds, and I planned on bringing 5 of them as a sin offering and 5 of them as a burnt offering. And then a bird that was designated as a sin offering. I've got one bird that was designated as a sin offering, and it gets mixed into the coop. So now what I'll be able to do is I'll be able to bring half of the birds as sin offerings, because there's no bird that was designated as a burnt offering. So I can still take the half that was going to be brought as a burnt offering and bring them with the one bird that was designated. But I will not be able to bring the other half and bring them as a burnt offering. Why? Because then I'll be bringing the sin offering as a burnt offering, which isn't allowed. So basically, if all the birds are, so to speak, neutral, 50-50, and one is specified, that I can only bring from that neutral group by its type, not the other type. Therefore, if the unspecified group is at least twice as large as the number of sin offerings that became intermingled with them, then half the unspecified group is acceptable, and half are disqualified. It appears to me that the priest offering the sacrifices should offer all of them on the lower portion of the altar, because we know that there was one definite sin offering bird over here, to the rites appropriate for a sin offering. So he's going to offer all of them below, But let's say there were 10 birds and half were meant to be sin offerings and half burnt offerings, and then an 11th bird came in, it would mean that the person will only be considered to have brought 6 birds as a sin offering out of the 11, because 5 of them were meant as burnt offerings, but they never reached their destination because we weren't able to offer a bird as a burnt offering because one of them were specified as a sin offering. Similarly, if a bird, and vice versa, if a burnt offering becomes intermingled with this unspecified group of doves, only the number of doves to be brought as burnt offerings in the unspecified group are acceptable. The number of sin offerings in the unspecified group and the burnt offering that became intermingled with them are disqualified. For a burnt offering has become intermingled with sin offerings, you'll have to bring all of the unspecified birds as the specified bird, and only to the number, and will only be counted to the number of that type that was in the group. Whether there are more doves in the unspecified group than the number of burnt offerings that became intermingled with them, there were more burnt offerings than doves in the unspecified group. Whether there are more doves in the unspecified group, whether there's more in the unspecified group than as burnt offerings, or if there are more burnt offerings than in the unspecified group, or if there were of equal amounts, only the amount of burnt offerings in the unspecified group are acceptable. Therefore, if the unspecified group was twice as large as the number of doves that became intermingled with them, half the unspecified group is acceptable and half is unacceptable. It appears to me that the priest offering the sacrifices should offer all of them on the upper portion of the altar according to the rites appropriate of the burnt offering. That's obviously if burnt offering birds got mixed in. I hope you're still holding out. The good news is that it's a very small chapter. So we are already almost halfway through. Now, when one unspecified, I want to just pull up a diagram for the following halachas. Let's put this on the side. Okay. Doesn't look like this is working. Yeah. So we'll keep going. Sorry, the image is not showing up. Back to the text. When one unspecified group becomes intermingled with another unspecified group, whether they are all for one purpose, meaning doves brought by Zavim together with doves brought by Zavim, or for two purposes, doves brought by Zavim together with doves brought by women after childbirth, whether they were both brought by the same person or they were brought by two separate people, if they were both similar, half are acceptable and half are disqualified. So again, I've got two coops of birds, one coop over here with 10 birds and another coop over here with another 10 birds. They're both two groups, and then the two groups got mixed together. They were both unspecified. So the halacha is that only 50% qualify. This applies whether the priest offered all of them on the upper portion of the altar or all of them on the lower portion of the altar, or half were offered on the upper portion of the altar and half on the lower portion. Half are always acceptable because since each group in its own right, 50% was supposed to go up and 50% was supposed to go down. So whatever you do, you're hoping that 50% you'll get right because that was the mark, 50%. So if you put them all on top, then the 50% that was supposed to be burnt offerings are good. The others are good. If you put them all on the bottom, then the 50% that was supposed to be sin offerings are good. If you put half on top and half on bottom, so there's a possibility that of the half that you put on top, maybe half of those were actually meant on the bottom. And the half at the bottom, half of them were meant to the top. So that's why we go by the 50-50 principle.
That's good. Thank God.
Because half the mixture is burnt offerings, half is sin offerings, and the sin offering is offered on the lower portion and the burnt offering on the upper portion. To explain, if we offer them all on the upper portion, half are acceptable, and they are the burnt offerings. If we offer them on the lower portion, half are acceptable, and they are the sin offerings. If half were offered on the lower portion of the altar and half on the upper portion, half of the half offered on the upper portion are acceptable, and the other half are disqualified because of the mixture. And acceptable ones are burnt offerings, and half of those offered on the lower portion are acceptable, and they are the sin offerings. Okay, so now we have two groups. This is where I had some pictures that I tried to load, but they're not showing up. Let me see if maybe I can try to quickly simulate it in the limited times that we have. Open up over here. PowerPoint. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Okay, I know it's quite limited, but we'll do what we can do over here. So we have over here a little bird. Not one bird, but we have two birds. Okay, we'll draw the birds over here. So we have birdie number 1, and then we have birdie number 2. And then over here, we've got two coops. We've got coop number 1, and we've got coop number 2. And in each of these two coops, there were a whole lot of birds. Okay. I'm sorry to take up your time, but this hopefully will be very helpful. Sorry, I didn't get this in place beforehand. It's been quite busy. So, two unspecified groups became intermingled with each other, and one was larger than the other. For example, one had 4 doves, one and one had 6. If we offered them all on the upper portion of the altar, or all on the lower portion, okay, we don't need to get to the diagram yet, then half are acceptable and half are disqualified for the reason we explained. Different laws apply if he offered half on the lower portion of the altar and half on the upper portion. If he did this after he asked, then the lesser amount are acceptable. If he did this on his own initiative, the greater amount are acceptable. I'm not going to get into much detail with that because I want to move on to the next thing. But the idea over here was that if you had, let's say, 6 offerings, six burnt offerings, and 4 sin offerings, so then it means that he'll walk away with 3 sin offerings. If he wasn't asked, then he could walk away with 3 kosher offerings, which are 3 sin offerings, if he didn't ask. Let's keep going. I'm complicating myself as well. This is the general principle. Whenever, on his initiative, the priest offered half of the upper portion of the altar and half of the lower portion, and it is impossible that doves of one owner will not have been offered on both halves of the altar, then the greater amount is acceptable. Since it is known that a portion of this person's sacrifices will be offered on the upper portion of the altar and a portion of the lower half, all of his sacrifices are acceptable. That person that brought the large group. When two individuals purchase pairs of doves together or give the money for them to the priest to purchase them, the priest may offer whichever he desires as sin offerings and whichever he desires as burnt offerings. For the identity of the sacrifices in the pair is determined only when purchased by the owners or when offered by the priest, as we explained. If there were groups of doves, some groups of sin offerings and others burnt offerings in front of a kohen, and he offered both groups on the upper portion of the altar or both on the lower portion, half are acceptable and half are not. If he offered half on the upper portion and half on the lower portion, without knowing whether it was a sin offering or the burnt offering that he offered on the lower portion, they're all unacceptable. Because here we surmise that it was the burnt offerings that were offered below, and maybe the sin offerings were offered on top. So in this scenario, we actually say that maybe he got it all wrong. If there were three groups of doves before him, one sin offerings, one burnt offerings, and one undefined, half burnt offerings and half sin offerings, that was the third group, without the purpose for any given dove being defined. If he offered all of them on the upper portion or on the lower portion, half are acceptable and half are not. If he offered half on the upper portion and half on the lower portion, only the group that was undefined, that was offered half on the upper portion and half on the lower portion, is acceptable. It is divided between the owners, and the portion allotted to each one is considered as valid for them. For the priest does not know which groups were specified as being sin offerings and which one was left undefined. The two specified groups are not acceptable because it is not known which one was offered on the top and which one was offered on the bottom. And it's possible that the burnt offerings were taken to the wrong place, they were brought down, and the sin offerings were brought on top. Okay, so what we'll discuss probably in tomorrow's chapter is a scenario where some of the birds flew from one cage into the other, and how each time it disqualifies parts as it moves from one to the other. Let's take the quiz, see how well we did. Sorry that it wasn't as... Sorry.
The quiz?
Yes.
Two questions.
Yes.
In regard to those that are unacceptable, they're left to die.
Yeah.
And that's come up, that concept has come up before. What is the purpose of letting him die? In other words, what would be, why can't they be freed or, go their own way? I'm not understanding, and I understand that they shouldn't be used for any other purpose, because they've been consecrated. But what is the point in actually virtually killing them right away? That's the one question. The other question is that I gave dove as a sin offering. You got it mixed up as the Kohen. You got it mixed up, and what you did was unacceptable. What does that happen to my status? I had to bring a sin offering, and now I don't know whether you've got it right or you don't have it right. Do I have to worry about that? That's my questions.
Okay, great questions. As far as the first question, I don't know the answer to that. The only thing I could think of suggesting, and I don't know if it's correct, is that if they were just left to fly away, if that's a possibility, an option, which I guess it could be, then they could still perhaps end up being used for other purposes. And that's a problem. I'm just to take an example, if you've built a magnificent Aron Kodesh and you've spent, 100,000 rand on it, the shul, the community, and then the shul decides to move and there isn't space for this Aron Kodesh. And it could be used for so many wonderful things. But the halacha is once it was used to store once it was used to store a Torah, then it has to be buried. you wouldn't be allowed to use it as a bookshelf, even for chomashim, because they're not on the same level as a Torah. Or for many other wonderful causes, it has to be buried. It cannot be used because we only go up in holiness, we don't go down. So maybe once these birds have been designated as a chatzos, and tragically they're not able to be used for that anymore because they've been mixed up, then if they get left free, then they'll end up being used in other ways, which would be problematic. That's what comes to mind, but it's still, I don't know what the answer is. As far as the second question, there is a general concept that there's a chazaka that a shliach does his shlichus, which means that if you ask somebody to do something, you can presume, if it was a reasonable request, that there wasn't stronger reasons, there weren't issues in this request, there weren't dangers to this or challenges to it. There is a general halachic principle that the chazaka shlichus shlichus. There's one can not just presume, but presume and establish that a shliach does his task. And in this case, the kohen is acting as the emissary of the person, and so I believe that the person would be able to halachically decide and have it considered like it was done correctly under that presumption. If he knew that the kohen had done it incorrectly, so then it's no longer about this presumed status, then it has already been undermined, and then although it wasn't his fault, ultimately what he wanted to achieve was not achieved. And so in such an instance, he would have to go and rectify that.